And now, marine weather around Alaska. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan. Now let's take a look at your Alaska marine weather coming up here for the weekend. And before we look at wind and waves, let's talk about how the ice is progressing. Early season ice development continues across especially the far north. We are going to see some much stronger winds develop out of the east here through the course of the weekend, so there'll be some shifting of early season ice, and where there is any open waters, obviously, wave heights will be building here along the Arctic coast down through the Chukchi Sea. Otherwise, ice continues to slowly develop here as we slide deeper into the late fall and early winter. On the weather map, late tonight, early Saturday morning, weak low pressure near Bristol Bay will be lifting up toward the Kenai coast as we get into later Saturday. A little stronger low, well southwest of Haida Gwaii. We'll be pivoting up toward the north and remain just off of the Panhandle coast later this weekend. We have a low out off the Kamchatka coast. It'll be working its way in toward the central Bering by late in the weekend, and then a big high pressure way up in the Arctic Ocean. It's this high in the Arctic Ocean and general low pressure here over the North Pacific and Gulf that's creating a tighter pressure gradient across the mainland as well as along areas of the Arctic and the West Coast. And by the time we get into Saturday afternoon, we expect a low situated just southwest of Haida Gwaii, low taking shape off the Kenai Peninsula, high remaining way up there in the Arctic Ocean, and then the low beginning to push eastward into the central Bering by the time we get into Sunday afternoon. And we have just elongated low pressure with the main low sitting just off of the Panhandle coast on Sunday afternoon, with brisk winds setting up here, especially along the Arctic and Chukchi Sea coastline. Looking at the wind and wave forecast for the Panhandle on Saturday, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, though as high as 25 knots here, Ketchikan, Metlakatla. Waves running 3-4 feet within Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, but 4-5 feet Dixon Entrance. Winds will be offshore out of the northeast, 15 to 20 knots, Yakutat, Cape Suckling down through about Sitka, but south of Sitka to off of Craig, 25 knot winds with waves as high as 8 feet. For Sunday, with that low approaching from the south and southwest, we expect there could be gale force gusts to 35 knots, Stevens Passage and Dixon Entrance, waves as high as 8 feet there, Dixon Entrance. As we get to the outer coast within 15 nautical miles of shore, we're looking at 35 knot east-southeast winds with gusts as high as 50 knots off of Craig and south of Sitka with waves as high as 10 to 13 feet. Further north, winds trail off a bit to below 20 knots once you get north of Gustavus, to easterly winds at around 10 knots, Yakutat toward Cape Suckling with waves around 8 feet. And then as we go toward the northwestern Gulf, winds will be generally out of the northeast, 10 knots within Prince William Sound, 2-foot waves. Look for north winds 10 to 15 knots down the length of Cook Inlet, turning northwesterly there at the entrance. Waves right around 3 feet. For Sunday, though, later Saturday night into Sunday, winds are going to pick up out of the west-northwest, coming across Kamishak Bay and through the entrance of Cook Inlet, 40 to 45 knot gales, waves building 10 to 12 feet. As we get back toward Prince William Sound, easterly winds to 10 knots, waves a couple of feet there, but westerly winds at 10 knots there in the upper portion of Cook Inlet with waves running about 2 feet. Across Kodiak Island, we expect somewhat variable winds Saturday, turning westerly, 25 to 30 knots, waves 4 to 6 feet, highest there within Shelikof Strait. We look at northwesterly winds to 30 knots here across much of the Alaska Peninsula, waves 4 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side, around 8-9 feet on the Bering side. And by the time we get into Sunday, those winds do come down, still holding up, though, in the vicinity of Kodiak Island due to the proximity to the low pressure that's located there in the Gulf. We expect west wind Shelikof Strait 25 knots, waves 6 feet, 7-foot waves off of Akiak at 35 knots out of the northwest. As we go down middle and lower portion of the peninsula, we expect winds to turn more westerly at around 25 knots, with waves of 4 feet on the North Pacific side and 7 to 9 feet on the Bering side. Across the Aleutians, eastern Aleutians, northwest winds as high as 25-30 knots there toward on Alaska, turning more westerly toward the central Aleutians Aleutians and then back toward the southwest, 25 to 30 knots once you get out toward and west of Kiska. And for Sunday, winds will be out of the west, generally 25 to 30 knots here, eastern Aleutians, and 30-knot westerly winds there westward, especially from Atka westward out toward Kiska, and waves will be running 7 to as high as 10, even 13 feet there west of Adak. 8 to 10 feet on the Bering side, though higher, upwards of 12 feet as you get west of Adak up toward Kiska and Shimia. Along the southwest coast, 30-knot northwest winds within Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay. Waves there 5 feet or so. North winds off of the Yukon Delta at 25 knots. Northeast to north winds within Norton Sound with 5-foot waves. On Sunday, winds will come down. Still 30 knots, though, out of the northwest within Bristol Bay. 5-foot waves. 20 knots, 3-foot waves, Kuskokwim Bay. And then here look for north-northwest winds, 15 knots. Along the Yukon Delta on up into Norton Sound with waves generally up in those areas around 3 feet. On the north side of St. Lawrence and south of the Bering Strait, northeast winds 25 knots, waves 5-6 feet. Notice those Saturday's strongest winds just off of Point Hope and Cape Lisburne. 35 to 40 knot gales with waves of 7 to 9 feet. The Arctic coast, 25 to 30 knot east-northeast winds, waves 5 to 7 feet there. And then the winds will increase along the Arctic coast Sunday. We're looking at 35 to 40 knot easterly gales, especially from just offshore there, Utqiagvik to Kaktovik. And as we drop down through the Chukchi Sea, winds will be east-northeast 25 to 30 knots. And then once we pass south of the Bering Strait, generally we're expecting north winds at around 4 to 7 feet, but highest waves will be out here through the lower Chukchi Sea around 5 to 8 feet. And as a result, we expect rather brisk winds through the course of the weekend, which is really going to enhance the threat of heavy freezing spray and ice built up on any sorts of crafts. So keep that in mind. Thank you.